Now, RetroArch is a lot like pineapple on pizza. People take one look and they recoil in horror. However, also like pineapple on pizza, it is absolutely brilliant once you learn to love it. Please don't unsubscribe. So I've already got RetroArch installed, which I showed you how to do on the previous video. If you've not seen that, then be sure to click the link up here. Watch that video where I cover the initial setup and some little tips and tricks. So let's boot into RetroArch. So at first you might have to enable some permissions, but you're going to get this screen and it looks a little bit ugly. So firstly, we're going to go to our settings cog. We're going to come down to drivers and we're going to change our menu driver. Now you notice here it says restart required, so nothing is going to change immediately. So I'll tap on that. So the two I recommend are Ozone and XMB. So just to show you what they look like. This is Ozone, which is pretty good and usable. And this is XMB, which you might be familiar with if you are a PSP or a PS3 user in the past. And for the curious amongst you, this is RGUI. This works best on things like the Ambinix or the Mius, anything like that with a smaller screen. So now, for the purposes of this video, I'll be using Ozone as it looks better on camera. However, I normally do prefer to use XMB, which you'll know if you've seen my earlier videos. So the main thing to be very wary of when it comes to RetroArch is the settings will only persist if we save our configuration file. So to do that, we're going to go to this main menu tab, we're going to scroll all the way down, we're going to go to configuration file, and we're going to save the current configuration. So drill that into your brain. Save your configuration file, because what's going to happen is there'll be people in the comments who say things like, I changed the options and it went back to the old ones. Do you know why? Because they didn't save the configuration file. So make sure you do that. So just to take you around the RetroArch UI a little bit, we have our navigation menu at the side. Obviously, for if you're using the XMB, then it's horizontal rather than vertical, but all the options, all the menus, exactly the same. So we have our settings, which we'll dive into shortly. You have your history, so for games you've played previously. Favorites for your favorite games, images for any images you've taken, like screenshots and things like that. You can import content if you want to use RetroArch as its own app. However, in future videos when I cover front ends, the front ends will handle this for you, so we don't need to import content into RetroArch, but I'll show you how to do it anyway later in this video. So a couple of things, as this is a device that uses the Nintendo layout, I just want to change my confirm and cancel buttons because it's a little bit messy. So we're going to go to settings, we're going to go across, we're going to go down to input. I'm going to press my B button, which is acting currently as my confirm button. I'm going to go to menu controls and I'm just going to untick or disable menu swap, OK and cancel buttons. So I'm going to press B and they've already swapped. Then I'm going to press B again and it will go back. So do make sure you do that. So before anything else, I'm just going to make sure that I save that current configuration file. You nearly forgot, didn't you? Now it's time to set up our controllers. So we're going to go back to input. We're going to go to retro pad binds and we're going to go to port 1 controls. For analog to digital, we're going to set this to left analog. Basically what this means is if you're playing a game, for example like a Game Boy game where it only had a D-pad, it will translate the analog stick movements to D-pad, so you can use either. So if you press the right analog stick right, it's going to treat it as though you're pressing the D-pad right. So the device index, so it's recognized it as the Odin, it's the same controller, so don't need to worry about that. And we're going to go down to where it says set all controls. So once we accept this, it's going to ask us for a series of prompts. So we're just going to press the corresponding button and hold it for a few seconds. So for D-pad up, I'm just going to press the D-pad up key, D-pad down, so on and so forth. For L3, we'll click the left stick, and for R3, we'll click the right stick. And there we go. So we scroll to here, we should see all those keys are set. So we can save that controller profile, and then we can back out. I'm going to back out again. We're going to go to hotkeys. Now, hotkeys are basically keyboard shortcuts in a way, so we're going to need to set a hotkey enable. This is a key that we hold, and then when we press the corresponding button, it will trigger that hotkey. So I always use select for this. Obviously you can use whatever you want, but I think select is what most people use, unless you're crazy. So we'll press A, and then I'm just going to hold select for a couple of seconds. There we go. Now you'll see there's some options here. So for menu, toggle, controller combo, this is where you can pick some default shortcuts for the menu. I don't use this, I prefer just using a standard toggle. So for this, I like using the X button. So when I press select and X, it's going to open the RetroArch menu. The same for quit, I like having the start button. So you don't need to press and hold select when you're inputting these, just the key that corresponds to it once select is held. For fast forward toggle, I'm just going to hold right trigger. I don't use the holds. I don't use slow motion, but you can use things like the Y button I know people use, or any button you want. And for rewind, I don't use rewind because I use hardcore retro achievements, but you can use the left trigger or whatever you like. So you can go through these. If you want to enable some for save and load states, then you can do exactly that. Like I said, I'm not going to do that. So backing out, if we go down to our haptic feedback and vibration, we're going to enable the device vibration for supported cores. Now this won't work on everything, but if a core does support vibration, you're going to feel it. Just a nice little touch. Totally optional, totally up to you. So that's it for our input. So now we can look at some of the other options. But before we do that, let's make sure we have saved that config file. Next, we'll look at video settings. So for video, we want to use our Vulkan driver, which is the preferred driver for the AYN Thor. If you notice some weirdness, then you can just flip back to the OpenGL or the GL one, but Vulkan should do you right. Now, if we back out of the output settings and go to scaling, we can look at integer scaling. This is more to do with pixel-based games and how it renders the pixels. So you can turn this on, then you can overscale or underscale to help stretch the screen. You can change the aspect ratio. I won't go too much into these because it can be very game specific, but these are for if you want to take advantage of the full screen, like I said a moment ago. So once you get a bit more confident with RetroArch, you can have a tinker. For frame throttle, we have our ability to customize our fast forward rate. So for example, if you set this at 0, it's just going to go as fast as it possibly can when you trigger fast forward, which I wouldn't advise. I tend to set this at about 4 times because when I'm fast forward in a game, it tends to be a Pokemon or a JRPG or something that I've played before and I just want to skip through. But if you do it at infinitely fast, it's very, very difficult to control the character. So I think 4 is a nice happy medium. Obviously, you can have a play around with this and find what works best for you. Now, I'll be skipping over most of these other options because you can just leave the defaults. And in the case of things like playlists, they're not really relevant as our front ends will be handling how we operate RetroArch. But I will cover achievements. So you want to make sure if you set up a Retro Achievements account, like I mentioned in my previous video, and I advise you do, is go into here, enable the achievements and log in. Once you've logged in, you can customize the visibility to pick which notifications show. For example, I don't really care too much about the leaderboard stuff, so I'm going to disable that. The login messages are handy because it will tell you if it's a game that's compatible and anything like that. But it's also good to have things like the active challenge notifications, which can kind of prompt you if there's an achievement nearby. I'm also going to leave hardcore mode enabled. Like I said earlier, if you want to use save states, rewinds, cheats, that kind of thing, it will disable hardcore mode. And I'm going to enable unlock sound because who doesn't like a good unlock sound? Now for directory, a few things I'm going to set is firstly for our BIOS files, I prefer to have all my BIOS files in a folder on my root storage. So I'm going to press A. I'm going to go to my parent directory. So currently we are inside the RetroArch app. But if we go back a few steps, you'll see here. So this is my storage emulated 0, which is the internal storage. If you're on an SD card, if you go up a level or up a couple of levels, you'll see a 8-digit code like that. That is your SD card. But for me, I'm just going to use the emulated storage. So I'm going to go back and then I'll go to my BIOS folder and I'll use this directory. So there's nothing in there yet, but I'll show you where to pop your BIOS. And the same for save files. I like having my save files in an easily accessible folder because I'm going to use SyncThing in a later video. You can do the same thing for save states, but as I've said before, I don't use them. And then everything else in here, you can just leave on the defaults. Now for saving, we are just going to go back up to the saving settings. So I prefer to sort my saves into folders by core name. You can also do it by content directory, which will, for example, it'll give you a Game Boy specific folder. So if you swap across cores, all your Game Boy saves will be in one folder. However, some cores saves are incompatible with other cores, so it's easier just to keep them in their core folder. Okay, so now we've done all that, we are gonna save our current config. Okay, so now we're gonna actually need to download our cores. So to do that, we're gonna go to our main menu, we're gonna go down to our online updater, and then we're gonna go to our core downloader. Now, I'm gonna tell you the recommended cores that I use. You can pick whichever ones you like. Some of them have slightly different features, but it's entirely personal preference. So for most of these systems, I won't be downloading any cores. For arcade, I'm going to get Final Burn Neo, and you can see they are downloaded in the background as I scroll down. So there are 3DS and DS cores, but I prefer to use external apps for this, which I'll cover in future videos. For Game Boy and Game Boy Color, I like Gambate. For Game Boy Advance, I like MGBA. If you are someone who plays Pokemon and you want the ability to trade with your friends, then you want to make sure you use GPSP because that emulates the wireless adapter. But I don't tend to do that, so I'm just going to stick with good old MGBA. There is a Dolphin core, but I'll be covering the standalone version of Dolphin, which was much better, in a future video. For Nintendo, NES or Famicom, I like the Meisen core, although I have tried a couple of these and they're all pretty good. For N64, I like the Mupen 64 Plus Next GLES 3. For SNES, I just like the SNEX 9X, just the one without a year at the end. For Sega, I like the Genesis Plus GX. For Sega Saturn, I like the Beetle Saturn core. For Sony, I like Swan Station. However, I do tend to use Duck Station, which is the standalone version. And that's all of them. So once we've downloaded our cores, we can come down here and we can just make sure that we've updated our core info files, our assets, our controller profiles, our cheats if you use those, your databases, your overlays, and your slang shaders. So if you're someone who uses overlays and shaders, you're going to want to make sure that you do that. So we're going to give those a minute to download, and then we'll look at importing and booting a game. So like I said before, most of our times we'll be booting into RetroArch will be through way of a front end, so we won't have to do this at all. But if you want to just test out a game you've downloaded before you've set up a front end, then all you need to do is if we come down to import content, scan a directory, and then you can go to wherever your storage is, so either for your internal storage, storage emulated /0, or your SD card, which will have a random ID there. So I'm going to go into that folder, go to my ROMs folder, and I've only got one Game Boy game at the moment, so you can just scan this whole folder, but I'm just going to scan the GBA one. So you can see there it's found my Pokemon Blue. So I'm going to back out, and then you can see I now have a Game Boy playlist at the bottom. So for this playlist, I'm going to press the start button, and I'm going to set a default core. So if you don't set a default core, whenever you boot a game, it's going to ask you every time, which is kind of annoying. So obviously this is a Game Boy game. I've only got one Game Boy core, so I'm just going to set Gambate. And there we are. So here we go. We're going to press it, and we're going to press run. And we've booted straight into Pokemon Blue. I've got my retro achievements pop up there, and then we have got the game loading. So if you got this far, congratulations, you have booted the first game, and that can be one of the most difficult things when it comes to emulation, is actually getting a game running. So to demonstrate our hotkeys, if I hold select and press my X button, I get my retro achievements menu, my RetroArch menu, apologies. If I hold select and press my right trigger, I can fast forward, and it sounds awful. But I'm just going to show you some of the additional features. So if we go to our menu and we scroll all the way up to our top, our main menu, we want to go to this quick menu. So this will have game-specific options. So we can view what achievements there are here. So we can see how to unlock the achievements. If it says M, it means it's missable. We can enable some overrides. So if you have specific settings for a specific game, you can create an override profile. We can set some overlays. So if you have an overlay, so for example, if I set this retro pad one and I back out, you can see I've got a controller overlay, which I don't want. You can also enable cheats from here. I did do a whole video about cheats, so be sure to check that out. So we also have shaders. Shaders are essentially Instagram filters for your games in a nutshell. So if we go to shaders, you can enable more than one at a time, although do beware that they have an impact on your processing power, so you don't want too many. We're going to load a preset. We're going to use our slang shaders. So I'm just going to go for a border. So if we go to Game Boy Player and we pick a Game Boy Player Easy Mode, how does that look? So now you can see I've got this little shader, which is basically like an overlay in this case, but it looks like an actual Game Boy screen. That's pretty cool. So if you found shaders or settings that you really like and you want to apply them across all your Game Boy games or whatever device it might be, if you go back to your main menu and then you scroll down and go to your quick menu and then go down to overrides, you can save the overrides. Now you can save them as a game if you want it to be specific to the game. You can save them for the content directory if you want them to be specific to, for example, Game Boy, or you can save it for the core. So for example, the Sega core, which covers multiple systems, you can apply it to the core as a whole, and that will apply across your Genesis, your Master System, Game Gear, whatever other consoles that core covers. So I'm just going to save it as a content directory. So for BIOS files, again, they are technically copyrighted, so I can't strictly tell you where to get them. For the most part, for RetroArch, they are not necessary unless you are emulating PlayStation, PS2, I believe Dreamcast, and possibly 3DO might also need them. So the pack I use is Abdes's Retro Pack. I can't link it directly, but it's easy enough to find. So whenever you find it, make sure you get the RetroArch/Lacquer pack, which is pretty much the same as the RetroArch pack. So once it's finished downloading, we are going to go to our Z archiver and we're going to extract the whole folder to our BIOS folder. So we're going to open up Z archiver, go to our downloads folder, and then there's our zip folder. So we're going to press that and we're going to extract it. We're going to make sure we click the one with the 3 dots. That'll let us pick the destination folder. And then from there, I'm going to go to my internal storage and my BIOS folder, and we're going to press this little down arrow looking button here. So this should only take a moment. The Z archiver does seem to be the fastest at extracting these folders. So there we are, that is decompressed. Now, RetroArch will automatically grab the BIOS folder it needs, or the BIOS file that it needs, but inside here, there are a few that we'll need to come back for and grab in later videos. For example, these SCPH ones are to do with PS1, PS2 emulation. There's some Sega ones that we might need to grab. I think there's a DC one, which is Dreamcast. So there's our DC folder. So we'll need to come back to this when we cover Flycast in a later video for Dreamcast emulation. But if you are just using RetroArch cores, then it will grab the necessary one that it needs. And there we are, that is our setup guide for RetroArch. You can have a play around with importing different systems, trying different shaders, different overlays, all that good stuff. If you've got any questions about anything I've covered, please drop a comment below. If this video helped you out, then I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe. Please do make sure you subscribe because I'll be doing way more guides for the AYN Thor in the coming weeks, so you don't want to miss those.